Big Clint was minding his own business when a rookie cop smirked and said, "Step out of the vehicle, old man." The air went still, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Clint didn't move. He just stared, calm and unshaken. But the rookie? He had no idea who he was messing with. What happened next would ruin the cop's career, break the internet, and teach the world a lesson it would never forget. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The glow of the setting sun cast long shadows over the quiet highway as the wailing sirens of a patrol car shattered the evening's peace. Red and blue lights flashed behind an old battered pickup truck, signaling it to pull over. The vehicle complied, rolling to a smooth stop at the side of the road, dust swirling in the air as the engine idled. Inside the truck, Clint Eastwood sat calmly, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. He had seen this scene play out too many times before. A young cop, fresh out of the academy, full of arrogance and an overblown sense of authority, eager to make an impression. He exhaled slowly, already anticipating what was coming next. Officer Jake Calloway stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached the truck. The rookie officer had been waiting for an opportunity like this. An easy stop, maybe even an arrest. His training officer had drilled into him that traffic stops could be unpredictable, but this felt routine. He didn't recognize the man behind the wheel, nor did he care to. All he saw was an old pickup that looked out of place, moving too slow, like someone trying to avoid attention. Reaching the driver's side window, Calloway rapped his knuckles against the glass sharply. His stance was stiff, authoritative, the way he had practiced. "License and registration," he demanded. His voice clipped, leaving no room for negotiation. The window rolled down at an almost agonizing pace, revealing a face that had seen more years, more battles, and more life than Calloway could ever imagine. Clint Eastwood's piercing eyes met his, steady and unreadable. There was no fear, no uncertainty, only quiet confidence. Calloway narrowed his gaze, waiting for the old man to react with the usual nervousness or irritation. Instead, Clint just smirked, the faintest trace of amusement flickering across his face. "Son," Clint said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, his tone deliberate and calm. "You sure about this?" The way he said it made something deep in Calloway's gut twist, but he shoved the feeling down, doubling down on his authority. He wasn't about to let some old guy shake his confidence. "Step out of the vehicle," Calloway ordered, his fingers twitching near his holster. Clint held his gaze for a beat longer. Then, with an exhale, he reached for the door handle. The door creaked as it swung open, the sound heavy in the silent evening air. Clint stepped out slowly, his frame tall, his movements unhurried. The weight of his presence alone made Calloway shift slightly on his feet. Something in the air changed. The moment Clint's boots hit the pavement, the balance of power shifted, and Calloway wasn't ready for it. The door creaked open, its sound slicing through the tense silence of the roadside. Clint Eastwood stepped out, slow and deliberate, his boots hitting the pavement with a weight that sent an unspoken message. The soft glow of the setting sun illuminated the lines on his weathered face, his piercing gaze fixed on the young officer before him. Officer Jake Calloway stiffened, his grip tightening near his holster. He had expected compliance, maybe even resistance, but not this. There was something about the way this man moved, the way he stood, like he'd faced 1,000 battles and never lost a single one. The wind carried the distant hum of cicadas as Clint adjusted his jacket, his movements calm, almost lazy. "All right, kid," he said, his voice even. "Now let's try that again." Calloway swallowed but held his ground. He wasn't about to let some old guy intimidate him. "I gave you an order," he snapped. "Turn around and place your hands on the truck." Clint didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Calloway the way a lion might size up a cub trying to roar. "You got a reason for this, son?" His voice was steady, with just the right amount of challenge. "I don't need a reason," Calloway shot back, though his voice held a slight edge of uncertainty. "I gave a lawful order." A door slammed behind them. "Jake," Sergeant Miller, Calloway's senior officer, had finally stepped out of the patrol car. But he wasn't moving to back up his rookie partner. He was standing completely still, his face pale under the flashing patrol lights. His eyes weren't on Calloway. They were locked onto Clint. "Jake," Miller said again, his voice lower this time. "You really don't know who that is?" Calloway frowned, glancing between Clint and his superior. The sudden shift in Miller's tone sent a ripple of doubt through his chest. "What are you talking about?" Miller exhaled sharply and took a step closer. That, he said, nodding toward Clint, is Clint Eastwood. A brief silence followed, and for the first time uncertainty flickered across Calloway's face. The name sounded familiar, too familiar. His mind scrambled to place it, to connect the dots. But before he could process, Clint took one step closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. Calloway's body reacted before his brain did. His fingers twitched again toward his holster. Clint noticed, and for the first time his smirk faded. Clint cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the night air. Now, he said, his voice just a little lower, a little darker. Let's try that again. The air between them was thick with tension, but Calloway refused to back down. His jaw tightened as he clenched his cuffs, his pride outweighing the creeping sense of unease Miller had just planted in him. Clint Eastwood. The name gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he shoved the thought aside. It didn't matter who this guy was. On this road, under these flashing red and blue lights, Calloway was the law. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Calloway ordered, voice sharper this time. Clint didn't move. He stood firm, his piercing gaze locked onto Calloway, dissecting him, reading him like an open book. There was no fear in his stance, no hesitation, just a patience that made Calloway's skin prickle. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" Clint asked, his tone dangerously calm. Calloway exhaled sharply, his grip on the cuffs tightened. "Last chance," he warned, stepping closer. Miller shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temple. "Jake, listen to me. You don't know who—" "Stay out of it, Sarge," Calloway snapped. His hand shot forward, grabbing Clint's wrist. That was his first mistake. The second was thinking Clint Eastwood would resist. But Clint didn't pull away. He didn't struggle, didn't fight. Instead, he let Calloway snap the cold metal cuff around his wrist, his expression unreadable. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of bystanders. A few held up their phones, cameras flashing, recording every second. A woman gasped, "Wait, that's Clint Eastwood." Calloway hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his pride forced him to keep going. He grabbed Clint's other wrist, pushing it toward the second cuff. "You're making a mistake," Clint said, voice steady. Calloway clicked the second cuff into place. That was his third mistake. The moment the cuffs locked, the crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts, murmurs of disbelief. The sound of a dozen camera shutters snapping filled the air. Calloway blinked, confused, until his radio crackled with urgency. Miller grabbed his arm, his face pale. "Jake, you just arrested a living legend." The moment the cuffs locked around Clint Eastwood's wrists, the world seemed to pause. The metallic click echoed through the quiet evening air, sending an undeniable ripple of unease through the growing crowd. For a beat, there was silence. Then, chaos. "Wait a minute. Is that Clint Eastwood?" a teenager in the back shouted. A collective gasp spread through the onlookers like wildfire. Heads turned, phones shot into the air, fingers tapping furiously at screens. Flashing cameras illuminated Clint's face, the deep lines of experience and wisdom etched into his weathered features. "Are you recording this?" a woman whispered to her friend. "Hell yeah," the man beside her muttered, zooming in on his phone's camera. "This is history." Calloway barely noticed. He was too caught up in his own sense of authority, the adrenaline of the moment fueling his every move. He gripped Clint's arm, turning him toward the patrol car. "You have the right to remain silent. You should take your own advice, kid," Clint interrupted, voice calm yet cutting. Sergeant Miller, still standing frozen by the squad car, was as pale as a ghost. His fingers hovered near the radio clipped to his vest, but he didn't touch it. His breathing was shallow, his expression a mix of disbelief and horror. "Jake," Miller finally managed, his voice tight. You really don't know what you just did," Calloway scoffed. "I know exactly what I did. I took a non-compliant suspect into custody." Miller clenched his jaw. "That suspect is a national icon, you idiot." The rookie blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. "What?" Miller swallowed hard and nodded toward the crowd. "Look around you." Calloway finally turned his head. The scene before him was no longer a routine arrest. It was a media storm waiting to explode. Dozens of phones were pointed at him. News cameras had already arrived, and a local reporter stood just feet away, microphone in hand. He had unknowingly stepped into a spotlight brighter than anything he had ever faced. Then, the voices started. "Number sign Free Clint is already trending," someone shouted. "This guy just arrested a living legend," another voice added. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car painted Clint's face in a wash of color. but his expression remained unreadable. He didn't struggle. He didn't resist. He just watched Calloway, the ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a grand office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, a phone rang. The mayor of Los Angeles, sipping his evening scotch, glanced at the caller ID. His brow furrowed. It was his press secretary. A bad feeling settled in his stomach as he picked up. "You need to see this," the voice on the other end said, breathless. "What am I looking at?" the mayor asked, already reaching for his remote to turn on the TV. A brief pause. "Clint Eastwood just got arrested." The glass of scotch nearly slipped from the mayor's fingers. Back at the scene, Miller's radio crackled to life. A voice, sharp, urgent, boomed through the speaker. "Miller, Calloway, drop everything and report back to HQ. Now!" Miller's face turned ghostly white as he looked at Calloway. "Oh, God, the mayor wants to talk to you." The mayor's office was in chaos. Staffers rushed back and forth, phones ringing nonstop, screens flashing with live updates. At the center of it all, the mayor himself stood frozen, watching the breaking news banner stretch across every major network. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood arrested by rookie cop. Public outrage erupts. The footage played in an endless loop. Clint Eastwood, handcuffed, standing calm while the rookie cop, Jake Calloway, looks smug and oblivious. The crowd's gasps, the whispers of recognition, and the sheer number of cameras capturing the moment had turned a small mistake into a national scandal. The mayor grabbed his phone, his face red with fury, and punched in a number. Within seconds, Sergeant Miller answered, his voice hesitant. "Tell me this is a joke," the mayor barked. Miller swallowed hard, casting a glance at Calloway, who still stood rigid beside the patrol car. "Sir, it's real." "What the hell were you thinking?" The mayor's voice boomed through the speaker, making Miller wince. Miller turned toward Calloway and hissed, "This is the mayor. You better pray he doesn't fire you on the spot." Calloway, arms crossed, scoffed. "It's just some old guy. He resisted, so I handled it." Silence, then, "That old guy is Clint freaking Eastwood." Calloway's smirk twitched. He looked around at the still recording crowd, his bravado faltering. "Wait, like the Clint Eastwood?" Miller groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "Are you really this stupid?" The mayor's voice cut back in, each word sharp and deliberate. "Uncuff him, now!" Miller didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, fumbling to unlock Clint's restraints. "Sir, I am so sorry." But Clint barely moved. His wrists, now free, lowered slowly as he rubbed them, his expression unreadable. "Too late now, kid," Clint muttered, just loud enough for Calloway to hear. The rookie's stomach dropped. He had a sick feeling this wasn't going to just blow over. Then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. A message flashed on the screen. "Suspended indefinitely. Report to HQ immediately." Calloway's face drained of color as he read the message. His hands trembled. Before he could react, another officer approached, shaking his head. "You really did it this time, Calloway. The chief wants you off the streets. Now." Clint, watching the scene unfold, smirked. "Kid, this is only the beginning." The internet didn't just react. It erupted like wildfire, spreading the story faster than Calloway could comprehend. By the time he walked back into the station, his name was already the top trending topic across every social media platform. News outlets had picked up the footage, and within hours, the rookie cop had gone from being an unknown officer to the most hated man in America. Screens mounted on the walls of the precinct displayed breaking news coverage, showing the now viral clip of Calloway slapping handcuffs on Clint Eastwood. Every major network had seized the story, dissecting it from every possible angle. In a shocking incident caught on camera, rookie officer Jake Calloway arrested Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood in what many are calling the most humiliating blunder of the decade. A news anchor reported, the seriousness in his tone unmistakable. Calloway's stomach tightened. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to keep walking, ignoring the murmurs that trailed behind him. The whispers, however, weren't just inside the station. The entire internet was ablaze. "Urdish free Clint, Reiner, fire Calloway. You respect legends." Thousands of tweets flooded in by the second, each more brutal than the last. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday citizens alike were united in their outrage. Some demanded Calloway's immediate termination. Others were making jokes at his expense, mocking his arrogance in the now infamous video. A group of officers stood near the coffee machine, huddled around a phone. One of them snickered, turning to his partner. "Man, this kid really went and arrested Clint Eastwood? What was he thinking?" He wasn't, another officer replied, shaking his head. Calloway clenched his fist, but he said nothing. He had to believe this would blow over. Surely this couldn't be the end of his career, right? Just as he reached his desk, a voice from the television made his blood run cold. And in an unexpected turn of events, Clint Eastwood has officially announced that he is pressing charges. Everything stopped. For a moment, the room was completely silent. The words hit Calloway like a freight train. He felt his breath hitch in his throat as his vision blurred. Wait, what? He muttered under his breath. His hands fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his notifications. And then he saw it. The police department had issued a statement. Official statement from the police department. The actions of Officer Jake Calloway do not reflect the values of this department. Effective immediately, he has been placed on unpaid suspension, pending investigation. A slow wave of realization crashed over him. They weren't standing by him. They were throwing him under the bus. His phone buzzed again. A text from his superior officer, short and brutal. Turn in your badge. Effective immediately. Calloway's hands tightened around his phone, his jaw clenching so hard it hurt. His entire future had just collapsed in a matter of hours. He slowly looked up from the screen, but every officer in the room was already watching him. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others smirked. He wasn't just suspended, he was finished. The world had been watching. Now Clint Eastwood was ready to speak. The press conference was held in a grand hall packed with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning. Every major news outlet was broadcasting the event live, from CNN to FOX News. Social media platforms were streaming it in real time, millions waiting to hear Clint's response. At the center of it all, Clint sat calmly at a long table, flanked by civil rights attorneys and reform advocates. His face was as unreadable as ever, the years of Hollywood and real-life battles etched into his steely gaze. The man wasn't just a movie legend. He was an American icon, and now he was on a mission. A reporter in the front row adjusted his microphone. Mr. Eastwood, the country is in uproar over your arrest. Do you believe Officer Calloway should be jailed? Clint leaned forward, his fingers interlocked on the table. His voice was low, steady, and full of purpose. This ain't about me. This is about something bigger. The room fell silent. Reporters who had expected a fiery response, maybe even a personal vendetta, were caught off guard. Clint continued. One bad cop making a mistake is one thing, but the system that lets him do it, that's the real problem. I ain't here for revenge. I'm here to make sure this never happens again. The tension in the room thickened. This wasn't just another celebrity outrage moment. This was about to turn into something much bigger. From the back, another journalist called out, What exactly are you proposing? Clint straightened in his seat. Police reform, real reform, not just talk. He turned to the city's mayor, seated a few chairs away. You fired Calloway. Good. But what happens next time? You just suspend another one, let him back in after the media storm dies down? The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Clint didn't let him off the hook. Nah, that's not good enough. You want this to blow over? Then fix it. The room erupted in murmurs. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of Clint's unwavering expression. He wasn't demanding justice for himself. He was demanding a change that would shake the entire police system. At that moment, the police commissioner cleared his throat. His face was red, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Mr. Eastwood, what exactly are you suggesting? Clint's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Mandatory training for all rookie officers, increased accountability, and body cameras that never get turned off. The commissioner glanced at the mayor. The mayor glanced back. They were trapped. If they refused, they'd look corrupt. If they agreed, they'd be making history, but at the cost of upsetting the entire police force. Finally, after a long, tense pause, the mayor exhaled. We'll put it to a vote with the city council. Clint nodded once. Good. Now do your jobs. The press conference should have ended there. But then, a breaking news alert flashed across the giant screen behind Clint. Official statement from the police department. Effective immediately, Officer Jake Calloway is hereby terminated from the force. We do not condone his actions, and we will fully cooperate with any investigations moving forward. The journalist gasped. Sir, do you have a response? Someone shouted. Clint just leaned back, arms crossed. Should have happened sooner, but Clint wasn't done. He had one more card left to play, and when he revealed it, the entire city would never be the same again. The press conference had barely ended when the real storm began. Within hours, investigative journalists, legal experts, and internet sleuths started digging. Clint Eastwood's demand for accountability wasn't just making waves, it was turning into a tidal wave of truth. And at the center of it all, Officer Jake Calloway. At first, the department's official statement painted him as a young officer who made a poor judgment call. A rookie mistake, nothing more. But the deeper reporters looked, the more dirt they found. Late that night, a breaking news report flashed across national television. Exclusive. Officer Calloway's troubling past comes to light. The screen cut to an investigative journalist standing in front of police headquarters. She held a thick stack of documents in her hands, her expression grim. Sources inside the department have confirmed that Officer Calloway has been involved in multiple misconduct complaints, many of which were quietly buried. Records show excessive force allegations, racial profiling, and even an internal review that mysteriously disappeared. The screen changed to a grainy black and white security camera still. Calloway, 3 years younger, shoving a man against the hood of his patrol car. The date on the footage? The case was supposed to have been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Another clip appeared. Calloway interrogating a frightened teenager in the back of a squad car, smirking as he leaned in. Nobody's going to believe your word over mine. People had complained. People had fought for justice. And the department? They had swept it under the rug. The news anchor's voice turned sharper. It appears Officer Calloway was protected by senior officials. Some of his previous complaints were altered or flat out erased. The question is, how high does this go? The city exploded. Social media was in flames. Hashtags like Dirty Calloway and Corrupt Cops started trending. Celebrities, politicians, and activists jumped in. News networks debated if Calloway's entire unit was compromised. And then, just as the fire reached its peak, another bomb dropped. The mayor stepped up to the podium for an emergency briefing, his face pale under the harsh lights. After careful review of new evidence, I am ordering an independent investigation into the police department. We will uncover the truth, no matter where it leads. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. This was about an entire system built to protect men like Calloway. In a dimly lit bar across town, Clint Eastwood watched the news unfold. The screen reflected in his whiskey glass as he leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Now that's justice, but Calloway wasn't going down alone. He still had a few tricks left, and the next move was his. Jake Calloway had spent the past 24 hours in absolute freefall. The media had turned him into the most hated cop in the country. Protesters had gathered outside his apartment. News vans lined the street, and his former colleagues weren't even returning his calls. But nothing, not the job loss, not the humiliation, could have prepared him for what came next. A hard, rapid knock at the door shattered the eerie silence of his dimly lit apartment. Calloway, still dressed in the wrinkled button-down from the night before, froze mid-drink. The whiskey burned his throat as he swallowed hard. A second knock, louder this time. "Jake Calloway," a deep voice boomed from the other side. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Open the door." His blood ran cold. The FBI. Calloway's mind raced. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe his department had sent them to protect him. Maybe. The door exploded open, wood splintering as agents swarmed in. "Hands where we can see them." Before he could even register what was happening, Calloway was yanked forward, forced against the nearest wall. Cold steel cuffs clamped around his wrists. "You got the wrong guy," he stammered, twisting against their grip. "I didn't do anything." One of the agents, a tall man in a crisp navy suit, held up a thick folder. Inside were stacks of printed reports, bank statements, and surveillance photos. "You sure about that?" The agent's voice was calm, almost amused. "Because we've got enough evidence here to put you away for a long time." Calloway's stomach dropped. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and falsifying police reports," the agent continued. And that's just the start. A sinking realization settled over him. They knew, not just about Clint Eastwood's arrest, but about everything. The false charges he had pinned on innocent people, the bribes he had accepted, the reports he had destroyed. It was all coming back to haunt him. His knees nearly buckled as they dragged him outside. The world outside his door had transformed into a circus. Blinding camera flashes, microphones being shoved in his face, reporters shouting over one another. "Jake, are the allegations true? Did the department cover for you? How do you feel about Clint Eastwood exposing you?" Calloway squeezed his eyes shut. He felt like he was drowning. But then, something made him open them. Across the street, leaning casually against an old pickup truck, stood Clint Eastwood, watching, waiting. Calloway locked eyes with him, his breath catching in his throat. Clint didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because his smirk said everything. As Calloway is shoved into the FBI vehicle, he screams, "This isn't over!" But the world had already moved on. The fallout from Jake Calloway's arrest had barely settled when the real firestorm began. At first, the police department tried to distance itself from him, acting as if he was just one bad apple. A press release claimed that Calloway's actions were his alone, that they had no knowledge of his corruption. But Clint Eastwood wasn't done yet. The world had seen the rookie cop fall, but Clint knew Calloway wasn't the disease. He was just a symptom. If real justice was going to be served, Clint had to go deeper, and that's exactly what he did. 3 days after Calloway's arrest, the city woke up to something they never expected. A massive investigative report was released to the public, exposing a network of corruption that ran far beyond one officer. The report, funded and compiled by Clint's legal team and a group of independent journalists, contained hard proof. Falsified police reports, body cam footage that mysteriously disappeared whenever officers stepped out of line, internal affairs complaints that had been buried under mountains of paperwork. At least 7 other officers were implicated, and the department couldn't deny it anymore. By noon, the police station was in chaos. Reporters swarmed outside the building, shoving microphones toward anyone in uniform. "The public demands answers," one journalist shouted. "What did you know about these cover-ups? Are more arrests coming?" The police chief, now under immense pressure, had no choice. At exactly 3 p.m., a live press conference was called. The city's top brass stood stiffly behind the podium, their faces pale. "In light of recent evidence," the chief announced, "we are launching a full internal review. Officers found guilty of misconduct will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law." But no one believed them anymore, because Clint had already made his next move. 1 hour later, a second press conference was called, but this time, it wasn't led by the police. It was led by Clint Eastwood. He stood tall, flanked by a team of legal experts, activists, and none other than Sergeant Miller, the man who had tried to warn Calloway before it was too late. "Effective immediately," Miller announced, "I am stepping in as the new police chief." The crowd gasped. Clint had flipped the entire department upside down. Instead of letting the police cover up their own mess, he had exposed them so thoroughly that the mayor had no choice but to replace the leadership. And with Miller in charge, real reform could finally begin. As the press conference came to a close, a young journalist pushed forward. "Mr. Eastwood," she called out, "everyone thought this would be over after Calloway's arrest. Why did you keep pushing?" Clint adjusted his hat, letting a small smirk play on his lips. "Because some things," he said, "are worth fighting for." The journalist leans forward. "So what's next for Clint Eastwood?" He chuckles. "Let's just say, I ain't done yet." The fallout from Clint Eastwood's takedown of the corrupt police force didn't just change the city, it shook the entire country. News stations replayed the footage of Calloway's downfall on an endless loop. Political analysts debated how one man had managed to dismantle a system that had protected its own for decades. Activists hailed Clint as a hero, but as always, Clint refused to bask in the spotlight. "It ain't about me," he told a reporter when asked about his role in the scandal. "It's about doing what's right." But whether he wanted it or not, the world wasn't done talking about him. A month later, Hollywood got involved. A top-tier production company announced a documentary titled Eastwood versus the System, an in-depth look at how one of the most legendary figures in history exposed a corrupt police force and forced change. The film featured interviews with key players: Sergeant Miller, who had stepped up to rebuild the department from the inside, the mayor, who admitted he'd been blindsided by the depth of corruption, and even the civilians whose lives had been forever altered by the injustices that Clint had helped bring to light. But when the studio reached out to Clint himself, hoping to make him the face of the documentary, his response was short and to the point. "You don't need me in it," he said. "The truth speaks for itself." That was Clint, never looking for credit, never needing the applause. Meanwhile, behind bars, Jake Calloway was a man unrecognizable from the arrogant rookie cop who had once pulled Clint over. Stripped of his badge, his uniform, and the power that had once made him feel untouchable, Calloway was now just another inmate in a system he had spent years abusing. At first, he was defiant. He blamed Clint, the mayor, the media, anyone but himself. But as the days stretched into weeks, the reality of his actions settled in. One night, as Calloway sat in his cell, the small TV in the corner played a rerun of an interview with Clint. Young men like Calloway think power makes them strong, Clint was saying. But respect? That's something you gotta earn. Calloway stared at the screen, swallowing hard. For the first time, he truly understood. Back in town, Clint took a final stroll through the city. The streets felt different now, lighter, freer. People recognized him, tipping their hats, shaking his hand, thanking him. He acknowledged them with a nod, but he wasn't looking for gratitude. He'd done what needed to be done, and now it was time to move on. As he reached the edge of town, he paused, taking in the sight of the world he'd helped change. Then, without looking back, he muttered under his breath, "Respect ain't given, it's earned." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked into the sunset. The screen fades to black. But then, a phone rings. Clint picks up. A familiar voice on the other end says, "We got another problem." Clint smirks. "Guess I ain't done yet." The impact of Clint Eastwood's actions had gone far beyond a single corrupt officer. What started as one rookie's arrogance had unraveled a deep-rooted system of misconduct, forcing an entire city, and eventually the nation, to confront its flaws. The news cycle had been relentless. Every major network covered the scandal, breaking down Clint's role in exposing the corruption and demanding justice. Social media was flooded with support. Eastwood for Justice trended worldwide, and millions of people demanded real reform. And then something happened that no one expected. One evening, as Clint sat in his quiet ranch home, the phone rang. A deep, authoritative voice came through the receiver. "Mr. Eastwood, this is the President of the United States." Clint raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I just wanted to personally thank you," the President continued. "What you did, it wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about fixing something broken. We need more men like you." Clint let out a small chuckle. "I ain't much for politics." "Maybe not," the President agreed, "but you just helped change the system." And he wasn't wrong. Within weeks, lawmakers had drafted a new bill aimed at police accountability and proper training for rookie officers. The legislation ensured that no cop could wear a badge without being fully vetted, properly trained, and held to the highest ethical standard. The bill passed swiftly, with Clint's name attached to it as the inspiration behind the reform. When reporters asked Clint for a comment, his response was classic Eastwood: short, simple, and straight to the point. "I just did what needed doing." Meanwhile, inside a maximum security prison, Jake Calloway sat in silence, staring at the small TV mounted on the wall. The news was covering the newly passed bill, playing clips of Clint's role in bringing justice to the system. Calloway's face was gaunt, his arrogance long gone. He had spent weeks behind bars reflecting on his downfall. At first, he blamed Clint, then the media, then the mayor. But now, as he watched the man he had once tried to arrest change the world, something shifted inside him. For the first time since his arrest, Calloway muttered under his breath, "I was wrong." Elsewhere, Clint Eastwood packed up his truck, ready to leave town. The fight was over. He had done what he came to do. As he drove down the open road, the golden sunset stretched across the horizon, casting long shadows as his truck rumbled forward. A man of few words, he simply tipped his hat, a small smirk on his lips. Justice had been served. And for Clint, that was enough. But just as the screen fades to black, Clint's phone rings. He glances at the number, answering with his signature drawl. "What's the problem?" A voice on the other end replies, "We need you again." Clint exhales, gripping the wheel. "Well, guess I ain't done yet."